Tonight we examine the rise of an indelible influence on American technology. It's an influence that is distinctly part of the American experience, but like so many other such stories, originates from outside the shores of the United States. It's the influence of Indian engineers and entrepreneurs and the education that they have received both in India and at MIT, on Silicon Valley, and indeed on the world economy. IBM now employs more Indian engineers than American engineers. Indian engineers occupy the presidency of major American universities, and they have held or currently hold deanships at Harvard, MIT, Penn, Berkeley, Carnegie Mellon, and UCLA, among many others. Satya Nadella leads Microsoft. Sundar Pichai leads Google, and the list goes on and on. How did this happen? How did the fit between Indian-born engineers and the explosion of US-born technology come about? And why has the fit grown to be so seamless? In his new book, The Technological Indian, Ross Bassett asserts that in the late period of the Industrial Revolution, a small group of middle-class, English-language educated Indians began to imagine a technological India. They looked for help from the United States and from MIT in particular. They forged a profound partnership between MIT and top-level education in India, and for more than a century, that partnership has produced tens of thousands of engineers through the Indian Institutes of Technology. Ross is Associate Professor of History at North Carolina State University. He was a visiting scholar here in 2009 when he was first starting work on this book. Please join me in welcoming Ross Bassett. Hello.
Hi, John.
Welcome back.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It gives me some confidence I didn't screw up too badly the first time I was here.
You were our very first visiting scholar. I don't know if you knew that,
No.
but it was just such a thrill to have a visiting scholar at the museum those many years ago. And the fact that it was 2009 tells us all how long it takes to write a good book.
Yeah, and I had started some years before that even, so.
Well, fantastic.
So I'm not working on internet time, I guess you could say.
Well, now it's done and you're here, and that's fantastic. Let me ask you first a very simple question. What was your motivation for writing The Technological Indian?
Yeah. So I guess I've always been interested in India. Even when I was in high school, I was interested in Gandhi. And so as India began to develop technologically and it became sort of more prominent on the America's radar screen, I began, thinking about this as an interesting problem. As you know from my first time here, that I wrote my first book on the MOS transistor, and that was something I was pretty comfortable with. But this was something I was a little less comfortable with, but I had tenure, and so one of the things about tenure is that you can't get fired unless you really screw up badly. So I thought, this was an interesting topic and one that was maybe kind of risky, but it was really worth taking on.
And you mentioned that it goes all the way back to your roots when you were an undergraduate engineering major at Penn.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Yeah, so when I was at Penn, I met a couple graduate students from India who had been at IIT Madras and were studying chemical engineering at Penn, and they told me the story of the IITs, and I didn't know that. This was 1981. And so they told me about how IITs had been mentored by people from different countries. IIT Madras had been mentored by West Germany, IIT Bombay from people from the Soviet Union, IIT Kanpur from the United States. So it seemed really interesting. And then also in 1981, I traveled to India, and at that time, I was at a bus stop in Bangalore and met a young man who had a PDP-11 computer manual in his hand. And so that attracted me to him. I have a degree in electrical engineering from the University of Pennsylvania, and it really, I wasn't expecting when I went to India in 1981 to see someone with a PDP-11 manual. And so we developed a friendship, and again, that just got me thinking about connections between India and the United States and technology. That in 1981, the United States was often seen as having a somewhat distant relationship with India because India was often seen, the United States had kind of partnered with Pakistan to oppose the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So it was often seen that India and the United States had a not so good relationship, but that might have been true at the governmental level, but there were a lot of Indians who were interested in American technology, and I wanted to explore that.
And then you began your research at MIT even before you really had fully discovered this close connection between MIT and India. What did you find when you really began to dig through the records at MIT? Because you did an enormous amount of research there.
Yeah, so I initially went to MIT because MIT was the anchor institution in the program of assistance to IIT Kanpur, so that there were 9 American universities who provided assistance to IIT Kanpur, and MIT again was the anchor. But when I was there, I found it ended up sort of by happenstance. My plane got me to the MIT campus about by the time I flew up from Raleigh, and I could get to the MIT campus about 8:30 or so. And the MIT archives opened at 10. And so I spent some time just snooping around in the MIT library. And I found they had these commencement programs that listed all the graduates of MIT and where they were from. And so I saw that I could see the graduates of MIT who came from India. And so I thought that would be an interesting database to create, to make this database of all the Indians who had gone to MIT. And I initially assumed that this would have started in the IIT era, that Indians would have only started going to MIT after the IITs started. But I found this really wasn't so, that they had been going earlier.
In fact, I noted here, you found 1,300 Indian graduates from MIT between its founding in 1861 and 2000. And the first Indian graduated from MIT in 1882. Mm-hmm. Was that much earlier than you had expected to find?
Yeah, it was way, way earlier. So again, I was thinking 1950s. And so again, when I was doing this research, I had these MIT commencement programs. And so I was kind of torn. I was again assuming that maybe Indians would have started going to MIT after independence. So I was sort of torn, should I keep pulling these commencement programs off the shelf and looking through them, or should I just say there's no need? Obviously, Indians wouldn't have come to MIT, before 1947. But I felt, just that conscience within me that I needed to keep going back. And much to my surprise, as I pulled these earlier and earlier commencement programs off the shelf, I kept finding people from India who were going to MIT, and I was really quite amazed by it. It was something I could never have anticipated.
Now, you developed this audacious goal at one point to interview every living Indian who had graduated from MIT.
Yeah.
Audacious.
Yeah.
Because I noted you looked at, but didn't ultimately interview 850 graduates as a slice of your research. And you conclude that this educational connection has produced at least 2 generations of engineering talent, as you put it, trained to American standards but firmly rooted in Indian perspectives. That duality just cuts across your entire book, and I wonder what you made of that early on in your research and how that influenced you in the way you ultimately decided to write the book.
Yeah, so again, you do see this connection, and so we might think maybe of people in one dimension, but you see, looking at these Indian graduates of MIT, you see this both connection to their home country and also to American technology, and that really became clear to me throughout this, that this, it wasn't one or the other, but it really was both.
You use the word elites to describe this cohort, and sometimes that can be a kind of a pejorative term, elites, but that's not the way that you mean it in the book. And I wonder if you could just describe a bit, especially in the first wave of students who came from India to study engineering here, what their backgrounds were, what brought them here, how they could have gotten here in the first place.
Yeah, so these, we're largely, you could say, middle-class Indians. Often their families, sometimes the fathers might have been lawyers or government officials or other kinds of things, but they were committed really to developing India technologically, that India had been, a lot of people were clear that India had been left behind by the Industrial Revolution, that it had been disadvantaged by by the British, and that there were a group of people who really saw their future lay in technology. And so they were committed to using their positions to help India develop technologically. And that was really the mission behind a lot of these people who went to MIT in those early days.
And the final question I want to ask you about sort of the process of writing the book before we dive into the substance of it is, why MIT? I mean, we've got a pretty good university down the street here called Stanford, and there's another one called Berkeley, and there were alternatives, and yet MIT clearly became the magnet for so many of these aspiring young engineers. Why is that?
Yeah, and so let me just say, if any of you did go to that university up 101, so as an engineer, I kind of felt, another thing I felt in writing this book is I had to kind of have some controls in place to make sure I wasn't just telling a story that maybe I wanted to tell. So I made a database of Stanford graduates who who were Indian, and also a smaller database of Berkeley graduates. And there were a number of Indians, obviously, who went to Stanford and Berkeley, but nowhere near the prominence of those who had gone to MIT, and nowhere near the earliness that Stanford is celebrating its 125th anniversary this year. So it was started in 1891. The first Indian went to MIT in 1882. So Indians were going to MIT before Stanford even existed. But MIT, a couple of things about MIT, that MIT really had a mission, saw themselves as having a mission, and really proselytized in some ways for technology, and people saw that around the world. And Indians in particular saw that. And a number of Indians saw MIT as an alternative to the British system, that they were in this system because of colonialism, but they saw this as a way to avoid the restrictions that the British had put on Indians and really develop India the way they saw fit.
Let's turn now to the influences within India that led to the rise of this move toward technology. It's not easy for any nation to will itself into a particular new direction, much less in India, a country as diverse and populous as India is. But you described the major cultural influences within India that caused this turn toward technology at the end of the last century and, say, in the first 25 years of the 20th century. Can you talk about those major influences?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so again, in the late 1800s, a number of Indians saw that they had been left behind by the Industrial Revolution and were looking for, a way to advance and develop India. And so one of the influences that was surprising to me was that a number of Indian nationalists really saw, again, technology as a key. That one Indian nationalist who's very prominent, Bal Tilak, published some newspapers. One was called the Maratha and one was called the Kesari. And when I found the first Indian who had gone to MIT in 1882, he was in this city of Pune, and no Indian went to MIT for 20 years after this man went to MIT. And so again, from an engineering perspective, I was wondering if he was a signal or noise. Was he just sort of a random event? Was he kind of a fluke that he had ended up by MIT by, again, some sort of crazy set of circumstances that really didn't mean anything, or did he mean something? And so I found these newspapers that Bal Tilak had published, the Maratha and the Kesari, and these newspapers talked a lot about technology, that in these newspapers, Bal Tilak and his editors got news about the latest technological developments. They got news about Thomas Edison's electric light bulbs. The second issue of the paper had an article about an invention by Alexander Graham Bell, so that they really saw, while they wanted justice, you could say, for Indians, they also wanted technology. And so that was really a key thing. And so that was kind of a surprising aspect of this, that going to MIT was kind of a nationalist act, you could say. Mm.
And then you talk about the influence of J.N. Tata, the great entrepreneur and a great industrialist of that time. How much did he influence this change toward technology?
Yeah, so in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, you might say that J.N. Tata was almost one-person Indian industrial policy, that he had a vision of India developing technologically, being a player, you could say, on the global stage. And so he did a lot of legwork to do that. He had visions of Indian steel manufacture. He had visions of India being a leading player in the global textile industry, India developing electrical technologies. And so he really inspired a lot of people by what he did. And these visions often involved looking to the United States, that he went to the United States to develop steel technology, that he went to Pittsburgh and made agreements with veterans of Carnegie Steel to bring this technology to Jamshedpur and build the first indigenous large-scale Indian steel mill.
And then what caused the original consciousness about MIT and an American engineering education to take hold in this conversation that was happening within India that said, we must move toward technology, both in education and as a pivot for our economy? Why did MIT come to the forefront?
Well, I guess, again, it's a little bit idiosyncratic that the first Indian who came to MIT ended up in Boston trying to learn textile dyeing. So there were some sort of random parts of it. But I guess, again, MIT really set the goal for themselves as being one of the leading technical institutes in the world. And so as they published material, it was seen by some Indians. This wasn't necessarily a vision that was held by large sections of the Indian middle class, say in the late 1800s, but there were some. And India, these Indians, again, were given this vision. That one kind of intriguing example of this is that there was an Indian man named Dev Chand Parekh who in 1893 went to Cambridge in the United Kingdom to study to become a lawyer. And while he was there, he met the English economist Alfred Marshall. And Alfred Marshall was, a leading economist. And Alfred Marshall told Dev Chand Parekh, he said, "You Indians should not be going to Cambridge to study law. You should be going to MIT and study engineering, and then go back to India and set up businesses. And that's what you should do." And it wasn't. Again, it was a very small number of people who had this vision, but there were some people who, again, saw this, that India's future lay in technology and setting up businesses, and that they could do that better by looking to the United States than by looking to Britain. And
Parekh, as it turns out, was very influential in sending a number of people to MIT who then went on to become more influential in bringing more people.
Yeah, so it sort of started a snowballing effect. He sent a number of his family members, a number of other people, and he was from Gujarat, from Bhavnagar, and so sent a number of people from that area to MIT. And they later became very important in the IITs.
So talking about this period in the first quarter of the 20th century, let's say, when all of this was starting to percolate, I really expected at some point to learn something new about Gandhi that I didn't know, which was that somehow Gandhi was important also in influencing this move. But as it turns out, as you point out in the book, that was not true. In fact, the opposite was true. Can you talk about Gandhi and his viewpoint and why he wasn't more active in this way?
So Gandhi was famous as a critic of Western technology, and so he enters this story in sort of an odd way. I originally had thought this story would be sort of orthogonal to Gandhi, but so Dev Chand Parekh actually was a colleague of Gandhi, and so they worked together, but they had some tension. That Gandhi had a big program to develop hand spinning on a charkha. Gandhi believed in some sense that Western technology was not a good thing, wasn't really a model that India should follow. But at the same time, Gandhi had personal characteristics, you could say, that were compatible with engineering, that he was a real firm believer in personal industry, that he was a firm believer in time consciousness. He was a firm believer in that you needed to be quantitative. And so one of the interesting aspects of this. While Gandhi opposed Western technology, he encouraged personal characteristics that were very compatible with modern Western technology, that we often don't think about Gandhi this way. That I went through and read a number of Gandhi's letters in the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi, and you see a kind of a different side of Gandhi in those than maybe what we usually think of. Again, that he was one person called him a great industrial engineer, and those aren't usually the terms we think of when we
Not
think
at all.
of Gandhi. But he did have that sort of sense to him as you see his letters, that he was really passionate about a lot of things. That a couple of his letters that really, as he was promoting this idea of hand spinning, a couple of the letters that really kind of amused and intrigued me, that he wanted people to send reports about the work they were doing in hand spinning. And he would ream people out if these reports were not accurate. That if he would complain if people used approximations. He said, use exact figures. Don't just give me approximations. I want exact numbers as you tell me how many people in your area are hand spinning. So he was very passionate about this idea of quantification, about this idea of time consciousness, about these ideas of discipline, even though he really was very skeptical about factories and modern industrial technology as a whole.
Was there a point late in Gandhi's life where he did ultimately change his view about a technological education and the importance of technology to India's future?
I would say not explicitly, but some of these Indians who were connected with Gandhi, who went to MIT, there was a young man by the name of Bal Kalelkar who grew up in Gandhi's ashram, and he went to MIT after that. Gandhi was very ambivalent about this, that I think he realized by Bal Kalelkar going to MIT, he would not be really part of the movement Gandhi had envisioned of working on small-scale technology, hand spinning, and so on. But Gandhi supported him. That Bal Kalelkar wrote a letter to G.D. Birla, the great Indian industrialist, asking for support to go to MIT. And Gandhi, I have a copy of a letter where Gandhi's went through it and edited it by hand, sort of making changes to the letter. And then Gandhi actually presented it to G.D. Birla, who was an associate of Gandhi, a friend of Gandhi. And so, given that Gandhi personally presented this letter to Birla, it would have been hard for Birla to turn it down. That I think Gandhi gave it a pretty strong endorsement. So even while he said he was against modern technology, in some cases he could support it in individuals that he really liked.
Just to set the context for the audience, you told me earlier that Birla might be compared, say, to Rockefeller in the U.S. as an industrialist.
Yeah,
a very successful one.
Yeah. So, really one of the leading industrialists in India. I'm assuming that most of the people of South Asian ancestry in the audience are familiar with G.D. Birla, but again, a towering figure in Indian industry. And so, yeah.
Now, what's happening educationally in India at this same time? When is IIT conceived of? When does it actually begin to take root and start to flourish?
Yeah. So the British have a kind of ambivalent attitude towards technical education in India, that they start some technical institutes, and now they're very prominent and very widely respected, but these institutes in places like Roorkee and Pune are designed to train Indians to work in the public works department, to work under British control largely. And so that's what exists before independence. But after independence, there is this idea of creating something that's modeled after MIT. And this really takes root, again, after independence. The first IIT is established in the early 1950s at a city of Kharagpur. And so they see that a new technological education initiative is important for establishing the technological India that they want.
In this post-war era, you mentioned that this is in the 1950s. You note in the book, and this is a quote, MIT would be the standard to which Indian technical education would aspire. MIT itself, though, was struggling to define its own place in the post-war world. And there was a standard being used there for comparison, but the university that it was being compared to was not quite sure it wanted to continue to be the outward-facing international university it had been for 50 years. Why was that ambivalence suddenly surfacing at MIT at the very moment India was sort of rising to meet it?
So I guess there's a couple of things. So one aspect of this is, right after World War II, MIT set restrictions on the number of foreign students who could come to MIT. And in this, you see, throughout the book, one of the intriguing things about this is that you see a lot of ambivalence that the United States has about foreigners coming to the United States on some parts, that the United States has very restrictive immigration laws, particularly restrictive and discriminatory against Asians for much of this time until 1965. But in 1945, MIT set restrictions on the number of foreign students who could come to MIT. And part of it, you could say, is understandable on the reason that they said they wanted to save room for returning veterans. But you also see that they expressed some concern that they thought that too many foreign students might change the nature of MIT. And you could say, again, this concern about immigration rearing its head at this time.
As we carry on here, Ross, I just want to mention to the audience, I forgot to say in the beginning, you have question cards on your chairs, so please fill out your question cards, and we're going to be collecting those in a few minutes, and that's how you get involved and send questions up to Ross, so please do that. Back to MIT, the post-war period is also marked by Prime Minister Nehru coming into power, and he has a very different view from his predecessors about education in India, and especially technological education. Can you talk a little about Nehru and the importance of his arrival?
Yeah, so Nehru becomes, of course, the first Prime Minister of India, and he really sees technology as central to India's future. And one example where we can see this is in 1949, when he comes to the United States to meet with President Truman. He makes a particular visit to MIT, and he goes there and he talks to the Indian students who are at MIT, and really argues that technology is important for India's future, and really argues that these students need to come back, and he says, make India a first-class nation, and that he sees India had fallen and become colonized, really, he says at this time, because they had fallen behind in technology. And so India needed technology to prosper. And so Nehru's vision of India is really a technological India, India where steel mills will be built, where atomic energy will be developed, and India where, again, it will be a technological player on the global scene.
And how persuasive was he at home with this vision?
Yeah, I would say he was very persuasive. I think that it was a vision that a lot of people shared, that technology was key to India's future. One aspect of Nehru's vision was that he saw the state, really, the Indian state, as being the leading actor in India's technological development, and so a lot of the technological efforts would be funneled through the state. So building of steel mills, by and large, would be done by the state. Development of atomic power would be done by the state. Also, other areas of research would be done by the state.
It seems that the 1950s were marked mostly by this strong courtship by Nehru and top Indian officials of the United States and U.S. universities, and MIT in particular, on the one hand, and great resistance by MIT on the other to any sort of future short-term expansion of its relationship, historic though it might have been, in India. Is that sort of an accurate characterization of the way that you saw that period of history? Yeah,
so I mean, that Indian government officials were really interested in getting MIT to be involved in helping establish an IIT, and MIT was reluctant for a number of years to get more involved. they were concerned that they didn't have the resources. And it really was, you could say, due to the persistence of Indians and Indian government officials that MIT got really involved in IIT Kanpur.
You mentioned that. So in 1961, Nehru visits the United States and then announces with President Kennedy that 9 U.S. universities, led by MIT, would provide assistance to IIT Kanpur. How did that come about, and why? How important was that moment to this whole development of the IIT system and really accelerating its development?
Yeah, I would say it was very important. So there were a number of IITs that were established before. So there was the first IIT was at IIT Kharagpur, just near Calcutta, and this was supported by a number of countries. And then after that, the Indians established a pattern where IITs would be supported by a specific country. So the IIT in Bombay was supported by the Soviet Union, and the IIT in Madras was supported by the West Germans.
I thought that was fascinating, actually, that the Soviets were involved in sponsoring an IIT school.
Yeah.
So what was up with that?
Well, again, the Indians sort of understood that they could sort of play these countries against each other and, and that was one of the things that the United States was very aware of, that the Soviets were supporting this IIT in Bombay. And so the Americans who were involved in IIT Kanpur really understood that they had to bring their A game, you could say, to Kanpur, that they had to establish something that was better than IIT Bombay. So they saw that was something that they were passionate about. And I think that was why they were able to get such the support of MIT and then also the support of these other 8 American institutions.
And how did that go? There was a little mini Cold War over technical education in India. So who prevailed? Was it the same story there as it was everywhere else?
I would say so. So one of the things, that the Soviets provided support to IIT Bombay, and again, the Americans were very concerned about this, but it really, IIT Bombay never became sort of a Soviet bastion, you might say. That there were a number of faculty members who had engineering education in the United States, and to me, one of the most intriguing moments of this came in as I looked at the history of IIT Bombay, came in 1972. So this is known as one of the worst moments in the relations at a government level between the United States and India. This was after the war between India and Pakistan over Bangladesh. The United States supported Pakistan, and the United States sent an aircraft carrier into the Bay of Bengal, sort of threatening India. And so, again, Richard Nixon and Indira Gandhi didn't like each other very much. So there were all these sort of negative things going on. And you might see this play out in the IITs, but it really didn't. That at IIT Bombay, at this very time, they were reorganizing their curriculum. And one of the leaders in this reorganization of the curriculum was a professor by the name of Suhas Sukhatme, who was an MIT graduate. And as they wrote the document explaining the reorganization of the curriculum, Suhas Sukhatme put in this document from IIT Bombay quotations from William Barton Rogers and Carl Compton, so the founder and president of MIT. And so he made it clear, in a sense, that IIT Bombay would be looking to the United States, the American technical education system, and not to the Soviet Union. And that was where they saw their future.
In this same period, you've taken us into the 70s already, and I want to just wind the tape back just a bit, because I want to go back to Birla, who we talked about a moment ago, this great industrialist, who at the same time had his own ideas about what made a good technical education, and made a very bold move and established his own university.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. And so one of the intriguing things about MIT's influence, you could say, is that Nehru and Indian government officials see that MIT is something that they would like to use as a model for the IITs, but even people in the private sector see the importance of MIT. And so G.D. Birla, this great Indian industrialist, has an engineering college in Pilani, so his ancestral hometown, and he has a vision of transforming this into a leading technological institution. And so he approaches MIT and asks for their assistance. And so his idea is to have a private MIT, so in contrast to the IITs. And so he's able, by persuasion and persistence, that he continues to write MIT President James Killian, saying, I have this idea. And he gives a lot of different suggestions. At one point, he proposes that MIT set up a branch campus in India and that he'll support it. And branch campuses are kind of a common thing now. They were something that was a little outside of what was standard practice in the early 1960s. But Birla eventually gets MIT to agree to support this, and so they established this Birla Institute of Technology and Science, again as a private enterprise MIT, maybe not with the same recognition of the IITs, but an institution that really sees itself as trying to produce students educated to the standard of MIT.
It's at this point in the story that I find something so ironic, because there is this rise of quality engineering education springing up around India, and there's a tremendous amount of investment and partnership going into that. And yet these, many prominent business families, by this time in the 1960s, they're quite prolific. If their children want that kind of technical education, they're still sending them to the US and overwhelmingly still sending them to MIT. So why is that dynamic present, and what is the effect at that moment in India?
Yeah, I guess, so again, this was a surprise to me that a number of prominent Indian business families did send their children to MIT. And so you have families like Godrej, you have families, Godrej is a leading Indian business that makes safes and soaps and other products. You have Kirloskar, an Indian business family that made initially farm equipment, but later on engines and other kinds of things. You see Chowan, an Indian business family that makes consumer products, soda and other beverages and cookies. And I guess what I see in these Indian business families sending their children to MIT is the families recognizing that they want their children to have a world-class education, that they want their children to sort of understand the really technology and business at the global level, so that they see themselves as operating globally. They just don't want a local education, you might say, that they want to operate on the highest global scale possible.
And then something important is happening in the U.S. at the same moment in immigration policy. So the United States in the early 60s greatly relaxes the restrictions that had been in place for immigration to the U.S. for education and other purposes. How did that affect this phenomenon that we're talking about?
Yeah. So again, before 1965, American law made it very difficult for Asians to come permanently to the United States. That actually, in the early 20th century, there were laws prohibiting basically Indians from immigrating permanently to the United States. That was relaxed a little bit after World War II. But so in 1965, those restrictions are lifted, and a much more equitable immigration system is put into place. And so prior to this time, all the Indians who come to MIT are basically expecting to return to India. But after 1965, it's now possible to stay in the United States. And so that really changes the dynamic greatly.
Well, in fact, they do stay in overwhelming numbers, don't they?
Yeah, yeah. So that really marks a very significant point, that after 1965, you see much more, an Indian who's gone to MIT is much more likely to stay in the United States than return.
So from the standpoint of government policy in India, and even just the hopes and expectations of the population at that point, especially these prominent business families, why, from their perspective, was that an outcome that was very different from the one that they expected? Were their hopes and dreams really that these extremely bright, very well educated, men and women would come back to India and not end up staying in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, it was very different, and even very different from what, say, the Americans who had helped support IIT Kanpur had expected. I think this was not something that anyone had really anticipated, that so many Indians who had come to the United States would end up staying. So it was something that was very, very different.
You make the point that it's not just simply economic and opportunity. There was a kind of an emotional feeling from the people that you talked to, that to return home would be starting over. You had come here, got an education, become really part of the swim in America, and that was a very tough thing to give up. How pervasive did you find that attitude?
Yeah, so especially in talking to people who had done doctorates, say, at MIT, so this is maybe one particular side that didn't benefit India so much, at least in the 1960s and 70s, of having that American educational system that they were connected to. So these people who had done doctorates in the United States often expressed to me that as they finished their doctorates and considered, what their options were, they often saw their options, if they went back to India, would involve basically giving up their research projects that they had developed, because very often these research projects were ones that were supported by the American technological system, sometimes by the American military, and were not projects that were really priorities in India. So they would have to give these projects up and start something else, and that was very difficult. And so often they would take a job in the United States, sometimes envisioning that they might just stay for a little while, and one thing led to another, and they would often end up staying for their whole careers.
And did you find it was the case that there wasn't the same level of project, whether or not it was defense related, in India? Were there corresponding opportunities? I mean, it's not as if giant companies like Infosys, for example, weren't springing up. They were. There were big IT companies and IT successes in India about this same time. Why was that not more attractive?
Yeah, so by the time, so Infosys came a little bit later, but so in the, say, 60s, 70s, and even the 80s, there weren't these kinds of companies that people often described wanting to go back to India and looking for opportunities and not really seeing them, and often maybe seeing the red tape of the Indian government as something that just suffocated any sort of, any chances they had of developing a technological business or really having a satisfying technological career. So they often saw, again, this red tape as something that just, was suffocating, and would come back to the United States, sometimes after a very short time in India.
You have this rather stunning statistic. Roughly 80% of the Indians who earned doctoral degrees in engineering from MIT between 1961 and 2000 stayed in the United States. 80%. Were you surprised by how high that statistic was?
I was, yeah. And, but, in retrospect, maybe I shouldn't have been. And so one of the things, and often those who would return, they would often return to an Indian educational institution like the IITs, that they're often just they didn't see the possibilities of, what they could do in India. There were a few cases of people who did return and become entrepreneurs in India, but that was a pretty rare phenomenon, especially before the early 2000s, say.
There were great opportunities opening up here for teaching as well. It wasn't just simply staying in the United States for business. I quoted those statistics, your statistics at the beginning about today, how many university presidents, how many university deans, how many, we didn't even talk about things like heads of think tanks, other academic pursuits, intellectual pursuits here. Were those opportunities, were there as many opportunities as, say, these bright young newly minted PhDs expected to find in academia here in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, so as many opportunities in India, you mean, or?
Were there as many opportunities here as they expected to find? Were there sort of a plentiful number of opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, there were great opportunities. Again, the American university was developing. There was a lot of funding in the 1960s that the military was putting in, so that this was a really attractive thing. This was also maybe the golden age of the American Industrial Research Lab. So IBM was increasing its research. You have research labs all around the country hiring people. So this was a real attractive place for Indian people who had doctorates from MIT at that time.
So as we move through to, say, the next 35 or 40 years beyond the 60s, all these trends just continue, don't they? I mean, there's never really a reversal. They just continue on, whether it's in business or in the political field or in academia. Would you have expected that flow to be reversed at some point and eventually for a return to India to take place?
And I guess it hasn't been completely reversed, but I think since liberalization in 1991, and with the development of Indian IT companies, there have been growth in opportunities in India, and you do see some reversal. I think a lot of Indians see it as more possible now to return to India and have a productive career than maybe they would have seen in the 60s or 70s. So if we go, if we extrapolate all the way out to the first decades of the 21st century, we do see some reversal.
Some reversal.
Yeah.
Tell me what the state is, what you learned about what the state is of the IIT schools in India today in doing your research. And I know you've just returned from a big book tour in India too.
So, I mean, the IITs are, again, leading technical institutions that really are very attractive to students, that have great magnetic power and have been very successful. They've been expanding the numbers of IITs that they've been developing, so they're continuing on. I think maybe that it's now possible a number of IIT graduates don't look so much to the United States for graduate education as they did, say, in the 1960s and 1970s. So that's one change that's happened.
Is China as competitive for IIT graduates today as they are in seemingly every other field?
Not that I'm aware of. I haven't really done any research on that, no.
And what about the ongoing connection of MIT to these schools and the continuing attraction of MIT to aspiring engineers, especially those doing graduate work? Is it as strong today as it has been historically?
I would say that MIT, again, really has that outreach. I mean, one just point of comparison I have, so I have my doctorate from Princeton, and I just found when I was in India that I was told that the president of Princeton was making the first visit ever by a president of Princeton to India. And
that took a while.
Yeah, I know. So again, by comparison, I think the president of MIT made his first visit in the 1960s. So they are sort of way ahead, I'd say, in global outreach compared to other American universities. And again, have a very powerful presence. That I spoke to the admissions officer, the director of undergraduate admissions at MIT, and he said that more Indians apply to MIT than citizens of any other country in the world besides the United States.
The last chapter in your book is the last subject we're going to talk about tonight, which is the Silicon Valley effect. And we have a number of people here who I'm going to recognize who are extremely notable Indians who've done well in Silicon Valley. But before we do that, let's take a few of the audience questions. Sure. And when you think about the first wave of U.S. educated Indians, say, up to about 1950, how would you describe their major contributions in Indian development? Can you? I think this question is really aimed at people who notably did go back to India and did make a contribution.
Yeah. So there were a number of ways that you might see the people in this first wave who made contributions. So one prominent example might be a man by the name of S.L. Kirloskar. He was the son of a founder of an Indian farm implement business in Western India, and he came back after graduating from MIT in 1926 and really helped sort of take this business, I guess I would say, to a new level of technological sophistication that he helped develop a oil engine business in this company. He helped develop exports when they were exporting things. One of the leaders in the Indian steel industry was one of these early Indians to have gone to MIT. So they were people who really, in some sense, helped lay some of the infrastructure for early Indian technology. Also, even with the IITs, that when the IITs were laid out, there was a committee called the Sarkar Committee, which is well known in India, that sort of laid out the principles of what they wanted. And two of the figures in this committee were graduates of MIT. So they helped sort of, again, set the technological standard in that way.
There are a couple of fascinating cultural questions here, and you did touch on these kinds of things in the book, so I'm glad someone asked them. Did you see a uniform representation of all segments of Indian society flowing in this educational stream that you describe in terms of race and religion and language and regionality and other things?
Yeah, so I didn't, and what was particularly intriguing to me in the early days, the distribution of Indians who went to MIT was very non-uniform, and in the 1800s and the early 1900s, it was much heavily weighted towards Western India, Gujarat, and what is now Maharashtra. So you don't see so many people going to MIT from Eastern India or Southern India. And so I don't know I don't really want to make any general statements about that, but that's just what I see. And then, again, you often see the Indians who went to MIT in this time period as being from a fairly elite background, that their fathers were often lawyers or other professionals. In the days even right after independence, you see some government officials who go to send their children to MIT. So again, a lot of people who are elite who might have maybe themselves gone to Cambridge or Oxford, but kind of see a different future for their children, and they see it as, again, rather than studying law, studying engineering, rather than studying in England, studying in the United States.
Here's a question that says, in the 1950s and 1960s, there was a great push in India to make everything in Hindi, but engineering and medicine and law stayed in English. Was this due to inertia, or did you see a conscious decision, sort of choice of language in these fields of education? How would you treat that?
Yeah, I haven't studied that explicitly, but I guess I would say that it was a conscious, would hypothesize that it was a conscious decision. I would say that I think a number of people saw that the strength of especially American education meant that there would be advantages to education in Hindi. At some of the IITs, there were sometimes efforts to change the education to Hindi, and they were largely unsuccessful.
Has any statistical analysis been done to see if MIT indeed had an unusual influence on IITs compared to other U.S. universities? When you think of, here's some examples on the question card: percentage of students accepted, number of students, size of university, et cetera. What did you discover about the statistics?
No, so I haven't done anything like that, and I mean that would be interesting. And so, and Indians who went to IITs, who went to the United States, went to a lot of different schools. So it's not that, and not even that necessarily that always the top students went to MIT. But one of the things you see some, sophistication in. There were some IITs which had what was called app sections, where in each class they would sort of divide up which schools you would apply to. So the top student might apply to MIT, the second student might apply somewhere else. And so the idea was to distribute where these students would go. But I haven't done any statistical analysis about that. And I guess I would say generally my argument is not necessarily based on only the Indians who went to MIT, but just that it was such a model for the whole Indian educational system.
So let's talk about Silicon Valley now as kind of the final chapter. The influence has been considerable, and you choose to tell this chapter through the stories of specific people, and some of them are very familiar to us, and some of them are even in the audience tonight, I believe. So talk about how you chose to tell the Indians, technological Indians in Silicon Valley story.
Yeah, so it's a little bit scary sometimes writing recent history when your participants are, are able to, question what you do. So
tell me about it.
Yeah. So again, as I went through my database and looked for people who played prominent roles, there were some that sort of came to my particular attention. And so again, and in writing a book like this, you have to make choices, and it's sometimes very hard, again, what you have to leave on the cutting room floor, you might say. But as I did this, it became clear to me that there were several people who were particularly prominent, that Thomas Kylath really at Stanford was an important figure. And Suhas Patil also, very, very important. So not, again, to neglect other people, but just that in some sense it was easier to tell the story through several people and, the roles that they had played. Professor Kylath came to Stanford in the early 1960s at a time when Indians did not have the prominent role in technology that they did, and he has had just an outstanding career at Stanford, having a meteoric rise from associate professor to full professor, making contributions in a wide number of areas. So,
personally recruited by Fred Terman.
Yeah. And just, what you see there, and recruited away from MIT, told that Stanford has a greater possibility, has greater potential than MIT. So
that's great. And then there's a kind of a fascinating museum connection that I didn't know about, which is some years ago we did a couple of days worth of a symposium here on the Plato system from the University of Illinois, which was the forerunner to so many things that have happened in computing. Don Bitzer at Illinois was the father of that whole project, and you tell this amazing story where Bitzer goes to India, discovers this young engineer named Suhas Patil, and among the many things that happen, he has brought with him some transistors, just some transistors wild and in the open, and he gives them to Suhas, and Suhas builds a digital computer out of them. And of course, Suhas goes on to found Cirrus Logic here in the Valley and was a founding board member of the Computer History Museum.
Yeah, and so again, to get a sense of the attractive power that MIT had, that Suhas told me that initially he had planned to go to Illinois and maybe work with Donald Bitzer, but MIT accepted him, and it was an offer that he couldn't refuse.
Did you find in your research now that there's a kind of triangle that's been completed from MIT to IIT to Silicon Valley? Is there a kind of stronger gravitational pull here than in any other part of the world, just as there are for so many engineers?
Yeah, and it shows something about, Annalise Saxenian has written a book comparing, Boston and Route 128 to Silicon Valley, and sort of how Silicon Valley became a more prominent technological region. And as you look at MIT graduates, you see, more of them who stay in the United States, being pulled to Silicon Valley rather than staying in the Boston area. So even though they have their start, you could say, in the United States at MIT, very often they end up in Silicon Valley, and it just is testimony to the magnetic power that Silicon Valley has to technological talent, to entrepreneurship.
Well, I do want to note that in addition to the people I talked about in my introduction and those that you and I have just discussed, we really do have a tremendous group of people who represent what you just said in the audience tonight. Kanwal Rekhi, who of course has been so important in networking and software, Kumar Malavali, co-founder of Brocade, Naren Bakshi, Vinod Dham, really kind of a who's who of this whole generation of Indian engineer entrepreneurs who've made such a difference in Silicon Valley. Let me ask you kind of one final question, Ross, which is the future. You know, not many historians are comfortable looking into the future and talking about what could happen, but do you see this connection between IIT, MIT, the future of engineering education, the flow of amazing talent from South Asia to the U.S.? Do you see it continuing, or do you see anything potentially interrupting it or diverting that flow in some other direction?
Yeah, so again, I'm a poor historian who looks back in the past, so I am one of those who is not so comfortable. But I guess I see it, you know, it seems like it will largely continue. I think, again, you see that, you know, these connections have been established, and I think they will continue, I guess, with the caveat that now India offers a lot more opportunities for Indian entrepreneurs and provides a lot more incentives to return to establish businesses in India than there had been in the past. So I think, you know, that will temper things a bit, but I think that connection between India and the United States is really very well established and will likely continue.
Well, you've done something that I think is tremendously difficult, because you've taken, as an engineer turned historian, and a very distinguished one, you've taken on a story that is part sociological, partly technical, partly political, and you've handled it with such care and such completeness, Ross. It's a marvelous book, The Technological Indian, so thank you for that, and thanks for being with us tonight.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you all for coming. Thanks, John.